Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the Axelerant webinar. I am Trupti Bhosale, your host and Technical Workforce Manager for QA at Axelerant. Can you imagine, changing the look and feel of your site with few clicks? Well, that's the power of dynamic theming. Today we are going to see how to do this in a very structured and easy way using Tailwind. But before we go into this session, let us welcome our guest for today, Siddharth Subramanian, who is a seasoned developer and a pro in theming. They have been a part of Axelerant since 2021 and have been contributing to various projects since then. Please welcome Siddharth.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hey Siddharth, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Trupti. Glad to be here.
So Siddharth, this is an interesting topic and I've been waiting to, see the webinar. But before we dive into your session, I wanted to know, how did you, get to this, Tailwind topic? How did you decide to do a POC on this topic? Was it a need or a curiosity? What was it?
So I'd say it's definitely a mix of both, right? It was definitely a need of the hour at the time. We were working on a project where we have one code base. We theme it based on whichever client we want to present it for. And things kind of started getting messy as we onboarded more and more clients, right? Because a new client means a new theme, new changes. And our project did already do this multi-theme setup, so we could switch on the fly, not a problem. But we started thinking, maybe there's a better way of going around it. Maybe we don't have to deal with all of the complexity we already deal with now. So that's the need of the hour part. And the curiosity part comes from us just looking at all the tools available. We looked at what tools we've used in the past. And eventually we sort of shortlisted Tailwind. And we were all really thrilled to figure out that we could do that with Tailwind.
Okay, so this POC is already done and implemented somewhere on a project?
It's not implemented just yet. I was working on a project, and as I was exiting that project, we had just started work on this, but we had gotten the approval for the Tailwind multi-theme setup, and the team already had a good understanding, started working on it. Things were starting to click into place. So I definitely hope that it gets implemented soon. It's definitely going to make everyone's life a lot easier.
So team, before we head on to our presentation, if you have any questions related to theme switching or related to Tailwind, please put it on the chat box and we will take the questions at the end of this session. Siddharth, please begin with the presentation.
All right. So as we see here, today I'm presenting on easy theme switching with Tailwind. And let's start with the quote from Albert Einstein: "Creativity is intelligence having fun," right? So it's a really great feeling when you get to flex a little creatively. You can look for what tools exist, how can we leverage them in ways that help us, and we're not just looking for a solution. This is when we look at all possible solutions and see which one is more fun to use, which one gives us the most benefit, and so on. So I was working on a type of project called a white label project. These are projects where you basically have one code base and you make multiple sites from that, right? And as I mentioned, we had different themes per client. So we basically used the same code base. We changed the styling up a little bit and presented for each client. The problem with such projects is they can run into maintenance issues over time if we're not careful. And currently there are a couple of popular approaches. One of them is to use one full theme per site. And the other approach is one base theme for all sites, and then you have a sub theme per website or per client where you just make some minor changes here and there. And I'll go into these right now. So when you have one full theme for a white label project, you have a few issues there, right? You have to maintain copies of all of your CSS. This is where we do all of our styling. And as you can imagine, that makes our code not very dry. There are repeats everywhere. There are copies we have to update. Say there's a change that has to go to all sites, right? It's very easy to miss making a change on a particular site because you may have missed that one copy. These kind of actions are monotonous. It's very easy to forget or skip over something if you're not careful. And lastly, commits can be filled with irrelevant messages and changes. Sometimes you have to do something for another theme and make sure that that is taken care of. And it can get a little hard to track over time, right? So that brings us to the other option, which is using a base theme plus a sub theme, right? So how this works is you have one set of core files that represents a sort of base theme, and then every client has their own version of this theme. You basically override values from the base theme. So let's say the primary color of the base theme is red, but someone wants it to be teal. You can just override that in the sub theme, and that's all your sub theme has, right? So you only have changes relevant to that theme. This is good, right? It works pretty well, but it also relies on the team adhering to project guidelines. So you have to document, how you make changes, where you make changes. And if those aren't followed, it can lead to a lot of problems. So they have to be enforced. If it's left unchecked, you can easily spiral into issues. We end up making changes however we want, or we realize that, the change I did, there's a better way of doing that, or we have agreed on another way to make that change. And it can become easy to lose track of this over time, especially when you have deadlines stacked on deadlines, right? And lastly, the base theme eventually becomes a form of tech debt because, time moves on, people will drop in and out of the project. And eventually you will have a group of people in the project who have no idea what the base theme has or what's supposed to do. So changing anything in the base theme becomes a bit risky. People start asking, is it really worth it? Let's just do it on the sub theme instead. So now you have a bunch of old changes on the base theme that is just overriding everywhere in the sub theme. So it becomes exactly like the previous approach, right? So then we thought, there has to be a better way. Like, okay, these things work with a certain caveat, but how can we make this better? There has to be a better way to go about this. And that's when we sort of stumbled upon Tailwind. So Tailwind is something we have used before in the past, though not like this. Tailwind is a utility-first framework. It provides a huge set of classes to work with, which I will show you in a sec how this works. And custom classes can be added, so we can tailor this to our use, right? And classes are added in the markup, so there is no separate CSS file. All of your styling lives within your components, which makes things very easy to keep track of. So why Tailwind, right? So first, Tailwind provides us with utility classes. As you can see in the screenshot here, you have this class tag, and there's a bunch of classes in there. These are all classes that Tailwind provides us, right? And each class is one rule. So in CSS, say you want to set the font size to 14, that would be one class. Let's say text-14. Or you'd have a text large or a font medium. You have like a text LG, font medium. So each class is one rule. So when you look at your component, you can look at all the classes and you know exactly how it's being styled, right? Custom rules can be added. So we're not just stuck with what Tailwind has given us. We can tailor this to what we want. So we can add custom classes, each having their own custom value. And lastly, there are extensions that can make Tailwind easier to maintain and tolerate. And what I mean by that is Tailwind is known for making your code a little bit more verbose, right? As you can see, we have a lot of classes here. It can get a little hard to read, but there are extensions that can help us make this a bit easier. We don't have to remember all of these classes. There are extensions that help with autocomplete. So there's definitely ways to use these to our advantage to make Tailwind a pure joy to work with, right? So how does Tailwind help us exactly? So with the Tailwind approach, the CSS is moved to markup, right? So this definitely makes it harder to justify, right? It's very easy to say, yeah, let's keep another CSS file. That's fine. We can choose when to load and when to not load the CSS file. So let it be there for now. But it's very difficult to justify, hey, let's keep an entire copy of this section of code and we'll see when to use it. Suddenly it becomes very harder to say that this sounds like a good idea. So now you have to think about, okay, do we really need a copy? Do we do it another way? Is there a more efficient way to go about it? It sort of forces you to make that better choice. Custom classes can be created in Tailwind, like I said. So we can create these values. We can set them to what we want. We can change them, as and when the requirements change. So that makes it very easy for us. And the value set for custom classes come from a config file. I will show you in a second how this works. But that means that once you have set the classes in each component, you don't have to touch the component markup again to change the value, right? You can change this from a configuration file that's elsewhere. And lastly, using JavaScript, we can dynamically set these custom values. So it's not just like you write it once and forget about it. There's ways where you can change this based on certain rules and conditions and all of that. Cool, demo time. So let's see what this looks like in practice, okay? So here you'll see I have a sort of demo site set up. It's a very simple site, not much going on. There's a few elements, there's a few colors. And I'll just walk you through the code a little bit and just show you what it looks like, right? So I'm going to breeze through these three files. This is pretty much how you set up Tailwind in any project, right? You have Tailwind base, components, utilities, and a CSS. This gets loaded into your project. You have a postcss.config file, and you have a tailwind.config file, right? That's pretty much the basics of it. And now I have this demo page that's set up, which you can see here. And here you see we have a bunch of components, header, spacer, card small, and so on. So let's open card small. And you see here, we're using Tailwind classes. So we're setting it to flex. We make the item centered. We have the cards rounded and so on. And this is fine. This is like now how Tailwind normally works. But here's where the sort of magic comes in, right? So Tailwind normally works with this config file. So you have this Tailwind config, and this is where you sort of extend and say, okay, you know what? I want a primary color that's unique to my project. I want to set my font sizes so I know which ones to keep track of and so on. But Tailwind doesn't support theming, like multi-theming out of the box, right? They have a light and dark theme, and that's fine. But you don't really have a way in Tailwind to switch between theme warm and theme cold, or theme red and theme blue. But with a little bit of JavaScript, we can sort of make that possible, right? So what we've done is we create a separate theme file, and this is the Tailwind object for theme 1, right? As you can see, we have these browns that you see on the site over here. We have a few spacings, we have font sizes and so on, pretty normal. Here we have a theme 2, which is a very similar looking config file, but if you notice, the colors have now changed, right? This is more teal, greens, there are a few changes for the spacing and headings and things like that. So how does this work, right? So we create these two themes, we create an object from them in a separate themes file, and we import this themes file into our Tailwind config, right? As you see here. And then what we do is we basically say, okay, I'll get a value from somewhere that decides which theme to use, and I'll just set that theme. So we basically get the current theme, we set in the values, and we're set, right? It's pretty straightforward. And now we need to figure out how to decide which theme gets used, right? So that's where we have an environment file. These files are pretty common over a lot of projects. It's basically a sort of hidden file where you can set in certain values. And in the project I was working on, we had each site on its own Docker container, each having its own environment file. So we could sort of use that to our advantage, right? So each environment file would have a unique value. Here we see it says theme 1, right? Let me go ahead and change this to theme 2. Let me save this and let me restart the project, right? Now if you come here, you see everything is changed, right? Now you have the teal colors, you have a thicker card because we have more spacing in theme 2. You can see here it says the current theme is theme 2. Now if I change to theme 1 and then I rebuild the project, you see we're back to the old theme, right? So this was sort of something that we really got excited about when we saw it in Tailwind, right? Because in Tailwind, once you write these, they're pretty much set in stone, right? The max you can do is something like this where you create different versions and then you pick which version you want, but it's still set to the same theme. But now that we can change the theme, it makes life a lot easier, right? You can have a separate config file for each theme, each website, each client, and you can just load that on the respective environments and you have your multi-theme setup, right? And this has a few advantages. Because we make these changes on a config file, we very rarely have to come to this file, right? The actual markup. So say there's a time where there's a change, I have to come to this file. I can now raise the point that, hey, I have to touch this. Is this change really necessary? Maybe this needs a second look. Can we do it another way? So it, starts a conversation of, is this the best way we want to implement this detail? So this gives us a really good point to say, hey, you know what, let's rethink this through and see, is this the best way to do it? Cool. So that is it for the demo. And as you can see, Tailwind also has some additional benefits. Like I said, it's easy to catch design inconsistencies. So say you have 3 types of buttons, but then they're used in different places on different sites. You can use that to start up a conversation and say, hey, these themes are supposed to be fairly consistent with minor changes here and there, but there's a big change I spotted, and that's going to become an issue for us to maintain. Should we reconsider aligning these themes so that they're more coherent, right? So it really gives us a place to stop and say, hey, let's talk this through. It can also reduce build tasks, improving build times. So we used to use Grunt to sort of convert all of our post CSS files into CSS. Then we had a task to compile all the CSS files. And, that sort of took time to build. And, we used to wait quite a bit for deployments, right? Tailwind does this on its own. So Tailwind has its own build step. You don't need to have a separate grunt setup for that. It'll just build when the project builds. So that's good. Tailwind also has a smaller bundle size, which means that if you have, let's say, 150 classes from Tailwind, but you use only 50 of them, Tailwind will only build the 50 classes that you use. So you're not unnecessarily building a whole chunk of code that you're not going to use, right? It speeds up the build time. It keeps file sizes small. It just makes it a much smoother experience for a developer as well, right? And like I mentioned, standard theming is now on config files. So markup is untouched once you've created a component, unless there's a feature request to really change how a component behaves. You can pretty much make all your styling changes on a config file, and it's very easy to track. And that's it from my end for the presentation. So let's have Trupti back.
Yes, Siddharth, thank you for the presentation. It seems very interesting. Before we, head on to question answers from the chat box, I have a question for you. So why did you pick up Tailwind only? Why not any other tool like Bootstrap or something else that is just as competent as Tailwind?
That's a really good question. So we did consider all these options, right? We looked at Bootstrap, we looked at AndDesign, we looked at Tailwind, and it came from a little bit of personal preference, honestly. We all have used Tailwind in the past. It's been a great joy to use. Yeah, it makes code a little bit longer, but that's not like a huge problem considering all the benefits it gives us. And we really didn't mind the length. So we thought, okay, let's give it a shot with Tailwind and then see how it goes. And Tailwind is also very flexible. Its build times are a lot faster. We thought, this might just be the way to go. There's just too many pros and very few cons in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, cool. So Karthik is asking if there is an active community and resources available for Tailwind and how can we use it?
So yes, Tailwind has a really vibrant community. They have a lot of resources. There's a lot of videos that teach you how to use Tailwind. There are extensions like there's VS Code extensions to help autocomplete, to help show you what colors and font sizes you have. There are various other tools that use Tailwind as well. So it's definitely not new. It's been there for a while and people have started using it. So you can definitely go ahead and check out a bunch of the stuff that they have.
I hope, Karthik, this answers your question. So we have an interesting question from Vivek. So are there ways to implement automated theme adjustment based on user interaction, location, or time of the day using Tailwind?
So not from the code. One thing I have tried is to get a automatic rebuild to change the theme. If you notice during the demo, I had to close the project and build it from scratch again for the theme to take place. So that is definitely something I'm trying to figure out how to do. But if you are handling these conditions externally, say something on like a CI pipeline or even on like a server where you have these environment values change, then yeah, it can definitely work. The conditions that need to be checked before the build step.
I have another question for you. So why didn't you try Site Studio instead of Tailwind?
So Site Studio is actually a different approach altogether. So maybe here's some context I can add for the project. So we were actually working on a decoupled Drupal project, right? So there the Drupal CMS provides us all the content and we sort of use part of the markup, but more or less most of the markup is ours and we sort of theme it that way. So if we were doing a general Drupal project where we do the theming from Drupal, we do a lot of our activity on Drupal, then sure, Site Studio would probably have been a very good choice. I have used Site Studio. It's a brilliant tool to use, but that just wasn't the tech stack that we were using at the time.
Well, I think we don't have any other questions from the audience. But team, if you have any other questions for Siddharth, please reach out to them for any other questions on Tailwind. Thank you for joining everyone for today's webinar, and we will soon meet for other session soon. Thank you. Till then, take care. See you.